Howdy y'all, welcome to the Kentuckian. Today we're going to be talking about the top 3 tanks of World War II, my list of the top 3 tanks of World War II. As we'll get into the list, I'm sure that you'll see and agree with every single point that I make, and that you'll see that my list is pretty much perfect and that it's unquestionable, and I'm sure that there won't be any discussion in the comments below on what your opinion is on the top 3 tanks of World War II. Seriously, I'm excited to do this episode. This is going to be about the top 3 tanks based off of these main factors: reliability, availability, firepower, armor, speed, and what I call the X factor, which are some miscellaneous things that we'll get into. If you like what you're seeing, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That really helps the Kentuckian out and help me try and get to my goal of 1,000 subscribers. And if you really like what you see and you'd like to support the Kentuckian and support me, my Patreon is linked down in the description below if you'd like to consider that. I do want to say that I recorded this before and it was longer than I wanted it, so that long version is going to be going up on the Patreon page for my patrons, so they can have access to that if they like it. Let's get into the tanks and start with our number 1 tank, which is the M4 Sherman. So the M4 Sherman is, and I'll just say, it's one of my favorite tanks of all time. I've always loved it. But when we get into the stats, into these factors that I'm judging the top 3 tanks based off of, the first one was reliability. The Sherman's always been considered reliable, and in general, it is a very reliable vehicle that was fairly easy to maintain in the field. You could move it to where it needed to be. It wasn't extremely heavy, so if one was kind of knocked out and you needed to get a recovery vehicle there, you could get a recovery vehicle there. It was produced in large numbers, so it was very available, and it was a simple design. It was fairly easy to produce. Production quality tended to be very high as well. Now that also goes to the American system of production. While it took American production a while to get going, it had a lot of tooling, a lot of machines available, and once it got those things up and going, it could produce large numbers of very high quality equipment. Availability is not just whether large numbers of them could and would be made, though. Availability also has to do with transportation and those sorts of things, and transportation was something that with the Sherman was very much optimized. You think about transportation, it's not just taking a tank from the factory and to the front lines for America. For America, it's taking the tank from the factory to the coast and then putting it on a ship, sailing it across the ocean, and then taking it off the ship and then getting it to the front lines. And transportation was very much optimized for the Sherman. Not only were they able to build a large number of them of high quality, they were able to get them where they needed to go, which was an important factor in how available they were and how effective the Sherman was. The chassis was a solid chassis, and we'll see this. All 3 tanks that we're talking about had similar, this is a similar factor among all of them. The chassis was used for other vehicles, used for other things. It was a good backbone of the vehicle, if you will, so that it was used not just for these tanks. It was constantly upgraded, which is the same for all 3 of these vehicles as well. So it was able to deal with differences in combat demands, right? And what the battlefield and what war demanded. They could upgrade it, they could improve it, make it better, and that certainly happened a lot with the Sherman. When it comes to firepower, it had solid firepower. The main armaments on the M4 Sherman were either the 75mm howitzer or the 76mm anti-tank gun, and those comboed together, which was pretty common. You would have a tank platoon with both vehicles, so some would have the 75, some would have the 76. And with that combo, they could deal with virtually anything that the Allies in the West needed to deal with. And the Sherman was used a lot by the Russians as well, and they liked it decently well too. And one of the keys of war during this time, and even still today, but in understanding that, it's not just about who has the biggest tank, right? You ran into a lot of infantry, you ran into a lot of buildings that are fortified, a lot of pillboxes, a lot of towed guns, right? An 88 or 75mm pack or something that was towed into a defensible position that will rip your tank apart just as quickly as anything, maybe even quicker than a lot of tanks, and you need to be able to take it out. So it wasn't just a matter of could it knock out another tank. It could deal with most tanks if given the right situation, but it needed to be able to deal with a lot of different situations, and that's what the Sherman was really good at. The armor, as most people, if you know about these tanks, probably know, the Sherman's armor was not great. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't great. It's not going to stop a lot of the more powerful German guns that it was going up against, but it was enough for the purpose. Again, it's not just about can it deflect the most powerful gun out there. That's almost impossible to do, even for the Germans. It was extremely difficult to pull off, and the vehicles that were able to do that were extremely heavy, extremely large, extremely hard to maintain and unreliable, and extremely difficult to build in any kind of numbers. It had decent speed as well, fairly maneuverable vehicle. When you think about the X Factor stuff, the crews were generally decently hardcore. American crews were generally high quality. British and Canadian crews were the same. The gyroscopic stabilizer that the Sherman had did give it an edge, and it was kind of a primitive stabilizer in some ways, but it did function decently well as a stabilizer. And theoretically, what a stabilizer would allow you to do is to fire accurately while you're on the move in your tank. Back then, even if you technically had that capability at certain speeds, generally you're not going to shoot on the move. So you would stop to make a proper shot. And when a 30 to 45 ton plus tank stops, there's a lot of lurching and going back and forth and that sort of thing. Well, that's where the stabilizer really showed up as an advantage, because that meant your gun would either already be on target or be very close to on target, so you could get on target and get your shot off a lot quicker than the other guy, which a lot of times was very important in the outcome of a tank engagement. The ammo storage was an issue. That was one of the issues with the Sherman catching on fire and being knocked out. It had to do with dry ammo storage. Eventually that was fixed with wet ammo storage. Literally, you would have ammo stored in a box of, maybe not water, I believe it was water and a chemical mixed together. But that really reduced fires when a vehicle was struck and penetrated. The Panzer IV actually had a similar thing as well. And the crew layout was very solid for the Sherman. It was a high-profile, fairly large tank, but it also gave the Sherman crews a pretty decent amount of room to do their job, which is a very important factor in how effective a tank can be used. And one side note, and perhaps some people can help confirm this for me, I have heard it said that some German officers considered the M4A3E8, the Easy 8 variant of the Sherman, which was one of the more advanced versions with a special suspension and that sort of thing, as the best tank of the war. I've heard it said that they believed it was the best combination of speed, firepower, protection, and reliability, even than their own tanks. The second one, and this is a close second admittedly, but it's the T34. The T34 is a bit of a special case, and I know a lot of people would probably disagree with me on this, but I do put it in the second place, and I'll talk about why. When it comes to reliability, the T34 wasn't always the most reliable. I think I've talked about this before, but Russian manufacturing was different at different points in the war. At some point, they became so desperate that they basically made, and I can go into detail as to why, but for time I won't, they basically made it so that it was on purpose that their tanks were produced to last for 2 weeks, which was the average survival time at the time. They were desperate for tanks, and they made that compromise. Didn't compromise on the quality of the guns, but that was about it. They were not reliable, they were not well produced, but they could produce vast numbers of them, and they did produce vast numbers of them. And so quality is kind of a weird thing. Also, Soviet quality has never had a good reputation. Not to say they've never produced anything good, but they tend to have a bad reputation for a reason. And there's a lot of propaganda and stuff going around that makes it a little difficult to figure out how much of the things of the statements about quality and reliability were true and were just maybe propaganda. But I'm not knocking the T34. It's a very good tank. I think it's a very cool tank as well. It was a well-engineered vehicle from everything I can tell, even if a lot of effort wasn't put into quality all the time. And overall, from those standpoints, it did okay, but it kind of depended. Late in the war, it got better, but reliability was sometimes really bad. Sometimes it was a lot better. So not as consistent as the Sherman, and that's one of the things that really put it into the second place for me. Came to firepower, it was sufficient. It didn't necessarily have the 75mm howitzer and the 76mm anti-tank gun like the two main gun variants that the Sherman did. But the 76mm that it had worked okay, although it was a bit more focused on taking out armor. The 85mm that the later variants were equipped with, same thing. It was a lot better at dealing with armor, but also probably didn't perform quite as well as a howitzer would have against infantry and other non-armored targets. However, the Russians faced a lot of armor. The Germans threw a lot more armor. It was a lot larger scale when it came to armored warfare and armored combat, so there were a lot more tanks fighting each other. And the Russians also tended to have a lot of other vehicles like self-propelled guns. Their vehicle strategy was a little different. And so that would account for some difference in the perhaps lack of capability or subpar capability when it came to dealing with infantry and those sorts of threats. And they were real threats. The armor was okay. Contrary to popular belief, it was not invincible. It was about the same or very comparable to the Shermans, probably slightly better. It was sloped a little better in things. But a lot of the statements or rumors or legends or whatever, however you want to phrase it, about the invincibility of T-34 armor came mainly, as my understanding is, came mainly from early war period when the Germans were facing T-34s and they were using a lot of 37 millimeter and 50 millimeter low caliber, not nearly as powerful anti-tank guns that did have a very hard time penetrating the sloped armor of the T-34. It had decent speed as well. Some of the X factor things, it did well with terrain, even better than a lot of tanks because of the ground pressure and the way the tracks were designed, which that was a big factor in Russia with a lot of mud and snow and ice and those sorts of things. So it did do better with those sorts of things, which was definitely a X factor in its ballpark, not its ballpark, excuse me, to its advantage. That's the phrase I'm looking for. But the crew layout was terrible. It was extremely cramped. And while there were variants that made that better, it was never great. It did improve, but it was never fantastic. And that does make a big difference in how effectively your crews can do their jobs. You need room to throw shells into guns and to move shells out and to drive your tank and do all sorts of different things that are needed in tank combat. And then the last tank, the third tank in my top 3 list of tanks of World War II is the Panzer IV. And it's a little more distant from It's a little more distant from the Sherman and from the T-34, but it was still a solid tank. It was generally reliable, not overly complicated. There were large numbers built, but they often got sidestepped for the more impressive but also less practical German projects. It was the basis for other vehicles, just like the T-34 and the Sherman were. And quality was solid. German production styles were different. Again, I don't want to get too much into detail. It takes too much time, but their production style was different, and it wasn't mass production the same way the Russians and the Germans did it. Although the Panzer IV didn't suffer from this as much, they liked to hand build or closer to hand build their vehicles, fine-tune them, kind of customize them in shop. And they kind of did. A lot of German manufacturers despised the idea of using as many same parts as possible and, you know, keeping the design as consistent as possible in the mass production that the Americans and the Russians did. And that did work to their disadvantage. The speed was okay on it. Armor wasn't great. It was comparable in some ways, and it depends on the variant, but it was comparable at times to the Shermans and the T-34s, but it wasn't sloped at all. And that sloping does give you a big advantage in deflecting shots if your armor's thick enough, and that was something that worked to its disadvantage. Its firepower was good after it got this long-barreled 75 millimeter. The early variants had a short-barreled 75 millimeter howitzer that did not do well against armor at all, though it was okay against infantry. The 75 millimeter, more closer to anti-tank gun, if not a proper anti-tank gun, was definitely much more effective. And maybe not quite as effective against infantry and that sort of thing, but still a generally effective all-purpose gun, and one that could deal with most vehicles that it would have come up against that it was facing with Germany. When it comes to the X-Factor stuff, and well, why didn't you use the Panther? And in some ways, the Panther was a very good tank, but it was very resource intensive. Availability also doesn't just have to do with the things we've talked about. Availability also has to do with the effective use of resources. So if you could build 2 Panzer IVs for every Panther you built, I'm not sure if that was the ratio or not, it's just for example, then it could be argued that the Panzer IV was the better thing to spend those resources on, even if the Panther was more confident in combat. And that competence, when you're talking about the lack of reliability with the Panther and other logistical issues and, you know, the more complicated nature of it, harder to get parts, those sorts of things, those can really limit the effectiveness of a tank, right? If you can't keep it running, if you can't get it to the battlefield, if you have to abandon it as soon as it loses a track or runs out of fuel because you can't hope to get it, you know, hauled back to a place where you can get it refueled because it's so heavy or whatever, Those things are a big disadvantage. They cause losses to go up and effectiveness to go down, and you could have used those resources on a more practical tank. And that's where I think the Panzer IV sits. I think it was a much more practical tank that they should have focused on building more of and upgrading. But fortunately for us, they didn't. When it comes to crews, they had some really good crews, but they lost all of those crews later in the war, and generally they wouldn't be put into Panzer IVs anyway. And they got a lot of novice crews later in the war, so much so to the point that even their really impressive vehicles, their Jag Tigers and their Tiger IIs that could take a beating and give a beating more than these tanks, while again maybe not being practical, couldn't even function as effectively because their crews didn't know how to properly use them, expose them to enemy fire when they shouldn't have, and got them knocked out, you know, hitting weak spots and that sort of stuff. Just really was the crews were a big issue, and that's always an issue with any of these vehicles that we're talking about. But that's my top 3 list. I hope that you found it interesting. Put down in the comments below what you think. If you agree, you don't agree, what's your top 3 list, and so on. And I'll be looking forward to seeing some of those comments, and I hope that you all have enjoyed this episode. I've enjoyed making it. Also, don't forget about our social media pages, and don't forget about our merchandise store as well, and the Patreon, as I mentioned before. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this old world. It's been Ryan Dalton of the Kentuckian, signing off.